I don't often talk about personal stuff in these videos, but here's one thing you should probably know about me. I love Halloween. It's pretty much my favorite day of the year, and honestly, I can't completely explain why. It's not like I'm a big fan of horror movies or other scary stuff. In fact, I suspect that actually being scared has very little to do with what I like about it. After all, Halloween is as much about the pageantry of the supernatural as it is about horror. Most people don't dress up in costumes or go trick-or-treating in order to scare people. They do it for the fun of pretending to be someone or something else. People who put on costumes with the intention of actually scaring other people are pretty uncommon, all things considered. Consequently, I don't associate genuinely scary games with Halloween all that much. Silent Hill, Bloodborne, even something as schlocky as Resident Evil is just too off-putting for me to identify it with a holiday that, to me, is about fun and not fear. So what would I call a Halloween game then? Well, there's only one series that really captures the spirit of the holiday for me, and that's Castlevania. Here's the thing. Castlevania is horror-themed, but it's not scary. The closest it really gets is grotesque imagery, but as anyone who's seen a gargoyle can tell you, grotesque sits on a knife edge between scary and silly. The Metroidvania format also doesn't really work with horror. It's focused around discovery, which is proactive, not survival, which is reactive, and it has your character continuously getting stronger and more capable, which means the further you progress in the game, the less scary it is. Entering a new area in a Castlevania game isn't tense and unnerving, the way it would be in a game like Dark Souls. Instead, it's more like going to a Halloween party with dozens of strangers in weird costumes. You want to see what these enemies can do and how they act, and that's a big part of your motivation to keep exploring. It's also worth noting that Castlevania, at least after Koji Igarashi got involved with it, wasn't a particularly gameplay-driven series. The combat in these games is fun, but not particularly innovative. In fact, the more innovative it got, the more it turned people off, at least if sales figures are anything to go by. Like it or not, what attracted a lot of people to Castlevania in its heyday was the aesthetic quality of the games. Art design, music, enemy variety, that kind of thing. All this raises an important question. Why is Castlevania like this? Why does it have an elaborate horror-themed setting, but next to no legitimately scary mechanics? Why is its gameplay focused on simple fun, when other aspects, like enemies and items, are anything but simple? Also, speaking financially, why is this such a beloved and frequently imitated franchise when it's a third-stringer in terms of unit sales? To figure this out, we're going to have to examine the Castlevania series in detail. We'll have to determine what inspired these games, how they were designed, and why they resonated with their audience to a degree considerably greater than the usual. In other words, we need to peer into Castlevania's soul. Castlevania's primary story influence is the 1897 horror novel Dracula. This is so obvious that I barely need to mention it, but let's go into it a bit deeper. What does the Castlevania series actually take from this classic novel? First, it obviously takes the eponymous main villain, and in some games it takes him nearly verbatim from the original source. Not a lot of people realize that the pop culture image of Dracula, with the black hair and the dashing good looks, is actually quite a departure from his appearance in the novel, where he appears as an old man with snow-white hair, deathly pale skin, and huge bushy eyebrows. In Symphony of the Night, these traits are all apparent, and Dracula appears as he was originally imagined, a charming but clearly past his prime aristocrat, whose courtesy and impeccable manners conceal sinister intentions. There are also several explicit call-outs to Dracula and other works of vampire fiction throughout the series. The names Jonathan and Mina, for example, the surname Morris, secondary villains named Carmilla and Orlok, and so on. On the other hand, the heroes of the Castlevania series are about as far as you could get from a faithful adaptation. The original novel was set in the 1890s, and its protagonists were typical Victorian gentlemen, a lawyer, a doctor, a professor, and so on. Most of the Castlevania games are set centuries earlier, and their heroes look like, well, barbarians, really. They look like they stepped right out of the pages of a medieval fantasy novel, probably written by R.A. Salvatore. And unlike in the original book, where Dracula is defeated through an extremely elaborate plan involving, among many other things, hypnotizing one of his victims to track his movements and putting communion wafers in boxes of dirt, seriously, in most Castlevania games, the hero beats Dracula by just bashing his undead skull in. There's also a huge difference in tone between the two. Dracula actually is a scary and unnerving story that can really mess with your head. It's essentially a work of suspense, like a Hitchcock film, and because it's told from a first-person perspective, it constantly leaves you with disturbing questions that you don't have answers for. How many times does Dracula have to bite people before they fall under his control? Is Mina going to turn into a vampire and kill everybody in their sleep? And why is Renfield so goddamn weird? Castlevania is nothing like this. The only one I can think of that really packs an emotional wallop at all is Order of Ecclesia, and even in that game, the plot takes up very little of your time. When Castlevania games do focus on story, they stick a lot closer to straight-ahead drama, big emotional speeches, villains giving hammy exposition, and generally linear plot development with an occasional shocking twist. But there is another vampire-oriented story that splits the difference between the cerebral scariness of the original Dracula and the over-the-top macho action of Castlevania, one that's been extremely popular in Japan since the early 1980s, and which is sometimes cited as a major inspiration for the entire series. Can you guess what it is? That's right, you can't get away from it in even the tiniest corners of the internet, can you? Seriously though, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure does have a major plot point that it shares in common with Castlevania, and that isn't even hinted at in Dracula: the concept of a family of vampire hunters destined to fight a villain who refuses to stay dead. In fact, there's no precedent at all in vampire fiction for a main villain who comes back before JoJo. When Dracula dies in the original novel, he's dead for good. There are also several references in the Castlevania series that suggest at least a familiarity with JoJo, such as the Stone Mask in Symphony of the Night, and the significance of the year 1999 in both Aria of Sorrow and the fourth arc of JoJo, Diamond is Unbreakable. Also, this might be reaching a little, but doesn't the main villain in Aria of Sorrow remind you just a bit of somebody else? Hayato. Actually, this isn't even the most obvious reference. That honor belongs to the boss Zephyr in Dawn of Sorrow, who, if you try to hit him while he's posing dramatically, will stop time and set up a bunch of knives so they'll hit you when time resumes. It's pretty hard to think that this isn't based on the final battle with Dio from Stardust Crusaders, especially considering that he says exactly the same line as Dio when he uses his time-stopping ability. So what's the significance of this? Well, I was trying to explain why Castlevania's setting and gameplay don't completely match up, and I think I found the answer. It's because from the very beginning, Castlevania has been a pastiche, like JoJo. It's a mashup of different time periods, different literary influences, and different tones. This is why it appropriates imagery and characters from horror stories without really behaving like one itself. This also goes some way toward explaining the popularity of the series, especially in the West. Americans love crossovers and mashups. Just look at the recent success of all those comic book movies. One of the things that made classic Castlevania fun is that it never took itself so seriously that it couldn't put in a goofy reference or a lighthearted quote just for the hell of it. And if you're going to dissect the soul of this series, you'd be a fool to ignore the undercurrent of humor that runs through it. So far, we've taken a look at some of the influences that Castlevania originally sprang from. Now let's take a moment to consider where Castlevania went with those influences. Despite what I said earlier about the series having fairly simple combat, there's no denying that the appeal of Castlevania before Symphony of the Night had a lot to do with its challenge, and the atmosphere associated with it. Back then, before Silent Hill and Clock Tower, this was actually one of the scarier series you could play. It had a dark horror-themed setting and gameplay that made you feel claustrophobic and constantly under attack. It was a lot like Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins, another popular series that mixed horror aesthetics with tough-as-nails challenge, although I think Castlevania was a bit more creative when it came to level and enemy design. This first phase of the series ended when Symphony of the Night permanently changed the franchise by introducing RPG mechanics and a much more open-ended approach to progression. From that point onward, Castlevania became much more about the castle, and much less about throwing the player into stressful combat encounters. I'll just come right out and say it. Symphony of the Night is an easy game. You can certainly die quickly if you're not being careful, but the game gives you lots of tools to cheese it with, and if you do a bit of exploring to find good weapons and health upgrades and such, I can't think of any boss battles in the game that are tough enough to require exceptional skill or commitment. Well, not any required boss battles, anyway. And frankly, the games that have come out since Symphony of the Night have been easy too. The one big exception to this is Order of Ecclesia, which seemed like it was trying to recapture a bit of the older Castlevania spirit while keeping the later Metroidvania design. If this was the goal, I don't think it really worked. Ecclesia just feels like an unusually difficult Metroidvania, not like the older games in the series. So is this precipitous drop in difficulty a sign that Castlevania was already losing its way as early as 1997? I don't think so. This may be a controversial opinion, but I think abandoning its focus on challenging gameplay was actually a sign that Castlevania was maturing as a franchise. In the late 80s, a game had to be super hard to attract interest. It was what was expected. And not surprisingly, there were lots of games back then that were just as hard as Castlevania, but didn't share the dedication to atmosphere that made it so unique. From the very beginning, Castlevania games have had beautiful graphics, at least for the time, stunning soundtracks, and a variety of backdrops and enemy types that put most other series to shame. What I'm getting at is that Castlevania dropped the difficulty because it didn't need it anymore. It had progressed to the point where just experiencing the game was fun. Symphony of the Night may be lacking in challenge, but I'd be lying if I didn't say the gameplay is a blast anyway. Weapons feel great to use, the movement upgrades make it fun just to move around, and there are so many different enemies that fighting rarely feels like a chore. When it comes to the Metroidvania games, the level of difficulty varies from low to middling, but the experience of playing, what some people call game feel, is consistently strong. If Mario is a series that's fun to play even when you lose, then Castlevania is one that's fun to play even when you can't lose. I can certainly understand the frustration felt by those who love the older Castlevania titles like Rondo of Blood or Super Castlevania IV, which have great atmosphere and kick the stuffing out of you. Metroidvanias can't give you that kind of experience, and the angry video game nerd and Ego Raptor probably aren't the only people in the world who lost interest in Castlevania back in the 90s. Nevertheless, this new approach to Castlevania did manage to attract some fans, who kept the franchise going for nearly 2 decades before the final nail was driven into its coffin by the suits at Konami. And why did they do that, you ask? Well, unfortunately, these games may have had loyal fans, but they didn't have a lot of them. Castlevania has never paid the bills for Konami. The closest the series has ever come to a hit is the original, back in 1988, and that one barely cracked 1 million units sold. In fact, this is arguably one of the least successful, important franchises ever. Here's a statistic that might surprise you. The BioShock series, which I would remind you consists of 3 games, is estimated to have sold about 25 million copies total. Castlevania, which has at least 20 major entries, has sold 5 million copies less than that. Mario Party, Lego Star Wars, and Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon all handily outperform it. Castlevania's sales put it in the same tier as such world-beating franchises as Frogger, Professor Layton, and J.B. Harold Murder Club. Oh, and Metroid, of course. When you get right down to it, what's strange isn't that Castlevania ended, it's that it lasted as long as it did. And who is responsible for this unexpected longevity? Aside from the team at Konami, obviously, I think the credit here has to go to a group of people I don't normally have many kind words for. Game journalists. Reviewers have generally been very kind to Castlevania, even when the market hasn't been. Every game in the series since Symphony of the Night has at least an 85% positive score on Metacritic, and I've read countless enthusiastic reviews in magazines and on websites. It was game reviewers like Jeremy Parrish who identified the essential similarities between Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night, and recognized that many later games borrow design elements from both of them. To a considerable extent, Castlevania owes its status as a classic franchise not to any large group of fans, but to the impression it made on a small group of influential critics. And I think what attracted these critics to the series was the same thing that drew me in. Its fun, slightly campy, but very imaginative, Halloween-esque atmosphere. Castlevania had a totally unique style that gave it a special niche in the gaming world. People may say that indie Metroidvanias have replicated its atmosphere since then, but I've played many of those games, and frankly, they don't come close. It's the structure of Castlevania that these games have copied, not its soul. No other series has ever managed to outdo Castlevania at its own game. No one was able to dislodge it from that niche. Instead, it fell out on its own. And nothing has really taken its place, either. That's why I refuse to consider Castlevania a dead franchise. Like Dracula, its soul may have shuffled off this mortal coil, but the potential is still out there for someone else to recapture the magic and make a game that gets all the same things right as Castlevania. Not just the exploration or the combat, but the art, the music, the humor, and the heart. And as long as people want to play a game like that, Castlevania isn't dead. It's undead. I've even heard rumors that Sony wants to buy Castlevania away from Konami, along with a few other franchises, and remake the original game as a PS5 exclusive. This is total pie in the sky, and the source is just some random forum post. But I want to believe it's true. If it isn't, then I guess I just have to wait around for Castlevania to come back automatically, the way Dracula does. How long does that take, anyway? 50 years? I'll be an old man by then. I mean, coffee cup. An old coffee cup. I'm not a man. Whoops. Oh, crap. What's happening?
So that's Castlevania Tragedy of Error. A little formulaic, but hey, when you have a formula this good, don't fix what ain't broke, am I right? Anyway, everybody, happy Halloween, and if I don't see you until New Year's, enjoy the rest of 2035.